The Nevada sun had a way of cutting into skin, not just warming, but searing, leaving every line of a man's face carved deeper than the desert itself. Ethan Callahan squinted against it, the brim of his hat low, sweat sliding down his temple, his boots pressed into the gritty soil at the base of the Ruby Mountains, where the land broke into jagged canyons and forgotten trails. For most, it was just another piece of desert no one cared to cross. For Ethan, it was the only place quiet enough to silence the war that still lived in his head. He had driven out there in his battered Ford pickup, the same truck that carried more dents than paint, intending only to scout fence lines and maybe clear brush before the wind set the dry grass ablaze. But what he saw that day stopped him cold. 2 white mustangs trapped at the bottom of a narrow canyon. The sight hit him harder than a mortar blast. One horse, a mare, lay trembling, her leg clamped cruelly inside a steel trap half buried in rock. Blood caked her once bright coat, the wound swollen, flies buzzing thick around it. The other, a stallion, stood guard, ribs sharp under his hide, circling her in desperation. His nostrils flared, his eyes wild with distrust. He reared the moment he saw Ethan on the ridge, a sound breaking out of him like thunder in a gorge. Ethan froze. Every instinct screamed at him to back away. He could call the Bureau of Land Management like the law demanded, report the find, let them handle it. That was what a sane man would do. But sanity had left him a long time ago, somewhere in the dust storms of Kandahar, or maybe in the quiet of a hospital ward, where he'd stared at his own reflection and not recognized the man looking back. He crouched, resting on his heels, whispering low, steady words that shook anyway. "Easy now. I'm not here to hurt you." The stallion stomped, ears pinned flat, a barricade of muscle and fury between Ethan and the dying mare. And yet, behind that fury, Ethan saw something that cut him deeper than shrapnel ever had: fear. Not just fear of pain, but fear of loss. The same kind of fear he'd felt when he couldn't drag Corporal Hughes out of the ambush, when the radio screamed coordinates and his own voice cracked, ordering fire on a village that was supposed to harbor insurgents, but instead had held farmers, women, children. He shook his head hard, forcing the memory down where it belonged, buried in the sand. The horses were real, the trap was real. This was now. He inched closer, hands open, hat tilted back so they could see his eyes. "I'm not the enemy," he murmured. "Not today." Hours passed like that. The sun arced overhead, shadows shifting. Ethan sat cross-legged on the canyon floor, talking until his throat rasped, letting the stallion get used to his smell, his presence. He didn't move when the horse lunged, didn't flinch when dust sprayed across his boots. He just breathed slow, like he'd learned in therapy sessions that never worked, except this time, the technique wasn't for him. It was for them. By nightfall, the stallion's circle grew smaller, his snorts less violent. The mare lay still, exhausted, every tremor a countdown. Ethan crawled close enough to see the steel biting deep into flesh. Infection had already set in, the stench sour in the air. If he left her, she wouldn't last the night. He stripped off his jacket, ripped canvas from the bed of his truck, and fashioned a crude sling. His hands bled against the rusted metal as he pried the trap open. The mare shrieked, thrashing weakly, but when the jaws finally gave way, Ethan almost collapsed with her. "Got you," he whispered, voice cracking. "You're free now. Just hold on." Getting her out of the canyon was a battle all its own. He rigged ropes to his truck, building a makeshift pulley with boulders as anchors. Sweat burned his eyes, muscles screaming as he hauled inch by inch, the stallion pacing at his side, sometimes charging, sometimes just watching. By dawn, the mare lay in the bed of his trailer, legs bandaged with strips from his own shirt. The stallion, after a night of hesitation, finally stepped inside too, unwilling to abandon her. Ethan slumped against the tailgate, chest heaving. He had nothing left in his bank account, nothing left in his heart to risk, and yet here he was with 2 wild mustangs staring at him as if he were the only thing standing between them and death. The drive back to his grandfather's old ranch was silent, except for the rattle of chains and the stallion's occasional stomp. Dust plumed behind him like smoke from a battlefield. The ranch wasn't much to look at: 20 acres of scrub and sagebrush, a cabin so weathered it leaned like an old drunk, fences sagging with rot. He hadn't even been living there full time, preferring a cheap motel on the edge of Carson City where no one knew his name. But now, somehow, this ruin would have to become a sanctuary. He led the horses into a corral he'd patched together from scavenged boards and rusted nails. The mare collapsed almost immediately, foam flecking her lips. Ethan crouched beside her, whispering nonsense words, the same way he used to calm wounded soldiers waiting for medevac. He pressed gauze stolen from a first aid kit against the wound, praying the bleeding would slow. The stallion stood over them both, muscles trembling with exhaustion but unwilling to rest. Ethan looked up at him. "You're not so different from me, are you? Guarding what's left, even if it kills you." The stallion's ears flicked. For the first time, he didn't rear, didn't threaten. He just stared, and Ethan felt the strangest thing: recognition. He spent that night in the corral, back against the fence post, eyes half shut but never fully asleep. Every creak of the boards, every groan from the mare, jerked him awake. When dawn broke, the sky bruised with storm clouds, Ethan realized he hadn't felt that needed in years. But need came with a cost. The ranch needed repairs, the horses needed medicine, feed, shelter. He had nothing but an empty wallet and a Purple Heart medal he kept hidden in a tin box. It wouldn't be enough. He knew it. Still, when the mare lifted her head and nickered softly, weak but alive, he swore to himself he'd see it through. 3 days later, she managed to stand for the first time. Wobbly, scarred, but standing. Ethan leaned on the fence, tears stinging his eyes. He hadn't cried since Afghanistan. Not for the men he lost, not for himself. But now, watching this battered creature take a shaky step toward the trough, something broke open inside him. For the first time, he didn't feel completely dead. As the sun dipped low, painting the desert red, Ethan sat on the porch of the sagging cabin, too tired to move. Ghost, the name he'd started using for the stallion, stood watch near the fence, ever vigilant. Willow, as he'd named the mare for her willowy resilience, rested against him. Ethan whispered, "Maybe we all get a second chance." The words felt dangerous, like tempting fate. And then, from the road beyond the sagebrush, came the crunch of tires. A plume of dust rose in the fading light. A dark SUV slowed, its silhouette stark against the horizon. Ethan stiffened, heart hammering. Out here, visitors never came without reason. The horses raised their heads, ears pricked, as the vehicle rolled closer. Ethan's hand clenched the railing. "Who the hell is that?" A mysterious SUV pulls into the ranch, triggering a new twist, the intervention of the law and the community. Readers will wonder, who is coming? The government? An enemy? Or something worse? The SUV didn't belong to the Bureau of Land Management, not yet. It was an old sheriff's vehicle, dust-caked and grumbling, driven by Ellis Monroe, the county sheriff who'd known Ethan's grandfather. Ellis stepped out, boots creaking, hat low against the desert wind. He was a man who carried the weight of the land in his voice, calm but firm. "Evening, Ethan," he said, scanning the corral. His gaze lingered on Ghost, standing stiff-legged by the fence, and on Willow, whose bandaged leg trembled as she shifted her weight. "Heard some noise about you bringing in mustangs. Thought I'd see for myself." Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't have the energy for explanations, but he managed, "Found them dying out there. Couldn't walk away." Ellis studied him for a long beat, then nodded slowly. "Can't fault a man for compassion, but you know what the law says. Wild horses belong to the public, managed by BLM. Folks around here, they notice things. Word will get out." The words landed heavy. Ethan already knew, but hearing it aloud was like a noose tightening. Still, Ellis didn't push. He tipped his hat, muttered, "Be careful," and drove off into the deepening dusk, leaving Ethan with silence and the uneasy weight of inevitability. That night, Ethan patched the stable roof by lantern light, hammering boards scavenged from the cabin walls. Every strike echoed in his chest. He'd sold nearly everything of value: his truck gun rack, his father's pocket watch, even the Purple Heart medal that had once been the only thing he couldn't part with. It had bought antibiotics, bandages, hay. He told himself it was worth it when Willow managed to drink water without collapsing, when Ghost allowed him to stand near without striking. But sacrifice had its limits. By the second week, Ethan slept in the cab of his truck, eating cold beans from a can while the horses ate what feed remained. Some nights, nightmares dragged him back into ambushes and IED blasts, but when he jolted awake, heart racing, the sound that grounded him wasn't silence, it was the low, steady breath of the mustangs. Word of his desperate endeavor spread farther than he realized. One hot afternoon, as cicadas buzzed in the mesquite, a dusty white pickup rattled up the drive. Out stepped a woman in her 40s, auburn hair pulled into a tight braid, a medical bag slung over her shoulder. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell," she introduced herself, eyes sharp but kind. "Sheriff mentioned you might need a hand." Ethan hesitated, arms folded, but Ghost's sudden whinny made the decision for him. Sarah walked to the corral without fear, boots sinking into the dust. She crouched low, letting Willow sniff her hand. The mare didn't shy away. "She's tougher than she looks," Sarah murmured. "But this leg..." She peeled back the bandage, frowning at the angry wound. "It'll scar. She may limp the rest of her life." Still, you kept her alive. That's no small thing. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unused to praise. Did what had to be done. Sarah straightened, brushing dust off her knees. And now you're responsible. BLM won't see it that way. To them, this is possession without a permit. The words hit like a rifle crack. Ethan turned away, pacing. He knew the risk, but hearing it again twisted his gut. What was I supposed to do? Leave her to die? No, Sarah said softly. You did right by them. But the law doesn't bend easy, Ethan. If they come knocking, fines could bury you. They can seize the horses. The thought of Ghost and Willow ripped from the corral nearly buckled his knees. He steadied himself on the fence post, watching Ghost step protectively between him and Sarah, ears pinned but not hostile, just wary. Sarah's gaze softened. These horses, they trust you. That's rare. If there's a way to fight for them, I'll help. But you need to be ready. For the next weeks, she visited often, teaching him proper wound care, guiding Willow through slow exercises to strengthen her leg. Ethan listened, absorbed, learned. At night, he practiced what she taught, whispering encouragement as Willow limped a circle, Ghost never more than a stride away. Sometimes, he found himself talking more than he meant to stories of the war he'd never told anyone else, not even the therapist at the VA. Ghost would stand still, ears forward, as if listening. Willow would nicker softly, pressing her scarred shoulder into him. They didn't judge. They didn't ask why he'd pulled the trigger or why the nightmares never stopped. They just stayed. The corral became his sanctuary. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone in the silence. But outside the fence, the world crept closer. One afternoon, as Ethan hauled buckets from the creek to fill the trough, his neighbor Bill Rollins leaned on the fence line, chewing a stalk of dry grass. His cattle grazed the adjoining pasture, gaunt from drought. Word is you're feeding strays, Rollins drawled. Not a smart investment when land's already dry. Folks don't take kindly to someone hogging water for wild stock. Ethan gritted his teeth. I haul my own. Haven't touched the creek more than I have to. Rollins smirked. Doesn't matter. Rumors travel faster than trucks. BLM hears about this. You'll wish you never brought them back. He spat in the dirt and walked away, leaving dust and unease in his wake. That night, Ethan sat on the porch, rifle across his lap, though he knew it solved nothing. Ghost and Willow grazed in the moonlight, their white coats glowing pale against the sagebrush. He wanted to believe their presence was enough, that saving them had given him purpose. But Rollins's words gnawed at him. 3 weeks after Sarah's first visit, Willow surprised them all by walking across the corral without stumbling. Ethan laughed a rusty, broken sound he hardly recognized as his own. Sarah grinned. See, second chances are real. He wanted to believe. Yet even as hope grew, so did the shadow on the horizon. It was late afternoon when the sound came tires crunching on gravel, heavier than a rancher's truck. Dust rose down the road. Ethan shaded his eyes and froze. A black government-issued SUV rolled slowly toward the ranch. Sarah set down her clipboard, face tightening. That's not me, that's BLM. The horses lifted their heads, nostrils flaring, muscles taut. Ethan's stomach dropped. He wiped his palms on his jeans, breath ragged. Everything he had fought for, everything he had given up, could be taken in an instant. The SUV stopped in a plume of dust. Doors opened. 2 figures stepped out, one man in a pressed uniform, another woman with a tablet and a camera slung across her shoulder. Mr. Callahan? The man called, striding forward. Thomas Riker, Bureau of Land Management. This is my colleague, Melissa Carter. We're here about the mustangs. Ethan's throat closed. His eyes darted to Ghost, who had already planted himself in front of Willow, ears pinned, muscles coiled. Sarah touched Ethan's arm. Steady. Don't give them reason. But Ethan's mind raced with one question that refused to quiet. Were they here to help or to take everything away? The SUV's doors closed with a thud that seemed too loud for the quiet ranch. Ethan stood stiff by the fence, his palms damp despite the dry Nevada heat. Sarah lingered close, clipboard clutched like a shield. Mr. Callahan? Thomas Riker repeated, his uniform pressed, his boots too clean for this land. He extended a hand. Ethan hesitated, then shook it grip firm, jaw tight. Melissa Carter hung back, already raising her camera, snapping photos of the corral, the scar on Willow's leg, the makeshift shelter patched with scavenged lumber. Ghost stepped forward, planting himself between Ethan and the strangers, his ears pinned flat, head low, nostrils flaring. Willow hobbled close behind, her limp evident, but her gaze steady. They're protective, Riker observed, jotting something in a leather notebook. How long have you had them? 3 months, Ethan answered. His voice was even, but inside every nerve hummed like a live wire. Found them trapped up in Ruby Canyon. The mare was in a snare. Would have died if I'd walked away. Riker nodded slowly. You're aware, of course, that removing wild horses from federal land without authorization violates federal law. Ethan's throat burned. He wanted to snap back. What law saves a bleeding horse in a canyon with no cell signal? But Sarah's steady presence reminded him to hold his temper. I know the law, Ethan said quietly. I also know she wouldn't have made it another night. Melissa lowered her camera. For the first time, she really looked at Willow leaning into the fence for balance, at Ghost's watchful defiance. They're in remarkable condition considering what you described, she said softly. Especially her. She's bearing weight on that leg. Thanks to him, Sarah interjected firmly. She stepped forward, her tone clinical but compassionate. I've monitored their recovery since the rescue. The wound was septic. His intervention saved her. His methods are unconventional, but effective. Riker's eyes narrowed, skeptical. Methods? Sarah gestured to Ethan. He approaches them like trauma, patience, presence, consistency. He doesn't break them. He builds trust. Riker made another note. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, hating how the attention pressed on him. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just trying to keep Ghost and Willow alive. Mr. Callahan, Riker said finally, standard procedure would be to impound the horses and issue a citation. Given the circumstances, fines could reach $10,000. The number hit like a bullet. Ethan's chest tightened. He had nothing left, no savings, no truck, nothing of value but this land and the horses. Melissa glanced at Riker, then back at Ethan. There might be alternatives, she said carefully. Ethan caught the flicker in her eyes, sympathy mixed with curiosity. Riker closed his notebook. We're piloting a trauma recovery study for mustangs. Typically, we contract with larger facilities, but he looked at Ghost, who hadn't moved, who still stood as if daring the desert to take one more thing. Your results are hard to ignore. Ethan frowned. You're saying, what? That I keep them? Legally? Provisionally, Riker clarified. With oversight. You document your methods, allow monitoring equipment, you'd receive funding for feed and facilities. In exchange, they stay here under your care while part of the study. For a moment, Ethan couldn't breathe. The thought of Ghost and Willow hauled away had been a noose around his throat for weeks. Now, Riker was loosening it, but only a little. He glanced at Sarah, who gave a subtle nod. I'll do whatever it takes, Ethan said, voice rough. Melissa typed something into her tablet. We'll need to present this to our supervisors. Expect a decision within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. An eternity. As they prepared to leave, clouds rolled over the Ruby Mountains, heavy with promised rain. The first drops hit the dust, releasing the scent of Earth long denied water. Ghost lifted his head, nostrils flaring, eyes on the sky. Willow leaned against him, both horses letting the rain soak into their coats. Ethan stood in silence, chest aching. He wanted to believe this was a sign. The promised 2 weeks stretched into 3. Each morning, Ethan drove into town, checking the public library's dusty computer for email. Each time, nothing. He filled the silence with work-patching fences, reinforcing the stable, walking Willow along gentle slopes to rebuild strength. Ghost watched him constantly, sharp eyes following every movement. At night, Ethan found himself talking aloud. Everyone else looks at me like I'm damaged goods, he confessed one evening as he brushed Willow's coat. You don't. You just take me as I am. Ghost snorted softly, as if in answer. It was the closest Ethan had come to peace in years, until trouble came knocking again. The crunch of gravel announced the sheriff's return. But this time, Ellis wasn't alone. Bill Rollins leaned against the cruiser, arms crossed, face smug. Got ourselves a problem, Ellis said, voice heavy. Bill's filed a complaint, says you've been diverting more than your share from the creek, claims his cattle are suffering. That's a lie, Ethan snapped. I've been hauling water from town, haven't touched the creek in weeks. Rollins spat into the dust. Doesn't matter. Complaints go to the county board. Investigation's coming. Folks will side with me. Always have. Ethan's fists clenched. He saw flashes of firefights, men baiting him into mistakes. He forced himself still. Ellis adjusted his hat, sympathy in his eyes. Just wanted you to be ready. When they drove off, Ethan collapsed onto the porch steps, head in his hands. Ghost and Willow watched from the fence, their eyes steady, unyielding. He forced himself up, walking to them. I'm not giving up, he whispered, voice hoarse. Not on you, not on this land. A week later, the email finally came. Melissa Carter's name glowed on the screen. Mr. Callahan, congratulations. You've been approved for a provisional permit under the Wild Horse Trauma Recovery Study. I'll be arriving Tuesday with equipment and program details. Riker sends his regards. Relief surged so strong it left him dizzy. They were staying. His horses were staying. He drove back to the ranch, rehearsing how he'd tell Ghost and Willow the news, even though they wouldn't understand his words. Still, when he reached the corral, Ghost stepped close, nostrils brushing Ethan's sleeve. Willow limped beside him, scarred but alive. "You're home," Ethan said, voice breaking. "You're safe." But his moment of victory shattered before it could settle. A sheriff's cruiser waited in the driveway. Ellis leaned against it, grim as stone. "Ethan," he said, "I need to warn you. Rollins isn't stopping. He's taking this to the county board, maybe higher. He's got friends who don't like what you're doing here, and they're ready to make your life hell." The wind whipped across the ranch, carrying the smell of wet sage. Ghost tossed his head, Willow pawed at the dirt, both uneasy. Ethan's relief drained into cold dread. The horses had survived snares, starvation, scars. He had survived war and silence. But could they survive a neighbor's greed, backed by law and politics? The question hung in the dry desert air, unanswered. Ethan got a temporary license, but Rollins escalated the fight, bringing in the council and the government. From there, the conversation shifted from keeping the horses alive to protecting the sanctuary and their future. Melissa Carter's SUV rolled up just after dawn, dust trailing in the desert air. Ethan had been awake for hours, already mucking out the stable, tension knotted tight in his chest. Today marked the official start of something he'd never planned for, a government partnership. Melissa stepped out, tablet under one arm, boxes of equipment balanced in the other. She smiled, businesslike but not unkind. "Morning, Mr. Callahan. Ready to make history?" Ethan gave a short grunt. "Ready as I'll ever be." She didn't take offense. Instead, she set to work, walking the perimeter of the corral. Small weatherproof cameras clicked into place on fence posts. Sensors blinked to life, measuring water use, feeding patterns, even heart rates. Ethan followed her, carrying tools, trying not to feel like his sanctuary was being dissected. Ghost shadowed him, pacing with restless energy. Willow limped behind, scarred legs stiff but healing. Their presence was grounding, but their unease mirrored his own. "Look at it this way," Melissa said as she adjusted a lens. "You've been doing the hard work all along. This just makes it official. You'll get funding, veterinary support, protection from seizure. Not many in your shoes get that chance." Ethan muttered. "Doesn't feel like protection, feels like scrutiny." Melissa glanced at him. Sometimes they're the same thing. By midday, the desert sun beat down like a hammer. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow as he logged his first observation notes in the binder Melissa had provided. Ghost had eaten steadily that morning, but stayed hypervigilant whenever strangers came near. Willow had allowed light pressure on her scarred leg during walking exercises. Writing it down felt strange, as if he were giving shape to thoughts he normally kept locked inside. Yet, when Melissa reviewed his notes, she nodded with real respect. "You've got an instinct for this, Ethan. Most handlers miss details like these." He shrugged. "Spent years watching for things others overlooked, kept me alive." She studied him a moment longer, then simply said, "And now it's keeping them alive." That evening, Ethan sat by the corral, guitar in hand. The instrument was battered, strings replaced with mismatched wires, but his fingers still knew the shapes. He strummed softly, a tune he hadn't touched since before the war. Willow flicked her ears, swaying slightly to the rhythm. Ghost lowered his head, breath steady. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. For the first time, the silence didn't feel heavy, it felt whole, but peace didn't last. 2 days later, Sheriff Ellis appeared again, hat in hand, voice weary. "Town hall meeting tonight. Rollins put you on the agenda. He's pushing hard, Ethan. Best be there." Ethan stiffened. "What's he after now?" Ellis hesitated. "He's telling folks your program's draining resources, driving up taxes, threatening grazing rights. He's got allies. If you don't speak for yourself, you'll lose the room, and maybe more than that." The town hall was a cramped room behind the library, ceiling fans stirring hot air without relief. Rows of folding chairs creaked under the weight of ranchers and townsfolk. Conversations buzzed like hornets, all circling the same point: Ethan Callahan and his mustangs. Rollins stood near the front, boots polished, voice loud. "We've all managed this land for generations. Then this man drags in strays, guzzles water, and now the government's cutting him checks while the rest of us scrape by. That ain't right." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Ethan sat in the back, fists clenched, chest tight. He hated crowds, hated eyes on him. His instinct screamed to leave. But then he thought of Ghost, the way the stallion planted himself between danger and the fragile mare, unyielding. Ethan pushed to his feet. "All due respect," his voice carried, rough but steady. "You're wrong, Bill." Heads turned, the room hushed. I haul my own water from town, built catchment systems. My usage is less than half yours. These horses, he faltered, breath catching. These horses were left to die. I saved them because it was the right thing to do. And if the BLM thinks that's worth studying, maybe it's time we admit there's more than one way to take care of this land. Silence stretched. Then, from the side of the room, a woman's voice rang out. He's right. I've seen what he's done. Those horses are thriving. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, calm and steady. Mr. Callahan's methods aren't waste, they're conservation. They're hope. The room fractured. Some nodded, murmuring support. Others scowled, muttering about outsiders and government interference. Rollins sneered, but for the first time, his certainty cracked. Ethan sat back down, heart hammering. He didn't know if he'd won anyone over, but for once, he hadn't run. Days stretched into a new rhythm. Ethan recorded notes. Melissa checked data feeds. Sarah visited weekly, praising Willow's progress. Even Ellis stopped by, dropping quiet words of encouragement. But every step forward brought new unease. Ghost grew restless, pacing more than usual, as if sensing changes beyond the corral. Willow, though stronger, leaned into him more, relying on his steadiness. One evening, Melissa reviewed footage from the cameras. She paused, frowning. Look at this. Ghost reacts differently at dusk. More agitation, more calling. Ethan watched the grainy image of his stallion pacing the fence line, staring toward the horizon. He's waiting, Ethan murmured without thinking. For what? Melissa asked. He didn't answer. The answer came sooner than expected. Late one afternoon, as Ethan repaired a fence post, Melissa approached with her tablet, her face unreadable. The board reviewed your case, she began carefully. They're impressed. More impressed than I thought they'd be. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans. So, what does that mean? It means, she said slowly, they're sending more horses. He froze. 3 mustangs, all injured during recent roundups. They'll arrive next week. The hammer slipped from Ethan's hand, thudding into the dirt. Ghost lifted his head, ears sharp. Willow pressed against the fence, restless. Ethan's pulse raced. His corral, his fragile sanctuary, had just begun to find balance. Now, it would be tested again. Melissa watched him carefully. Ethan, can you handle it? The desert wind howled across the ranch, carrying with it the scent of coming change. Ethan stared at Ghost and Willow, 2 souls scarred, but standing, and felt the ground shift beneath him. Could he bear the weight of more broken lives? BLM officially decides to bring 3 more injured wild horses to the ranch. Ethan, who has just found some balance, now faces a double challenge. The question remains, how will he cope as the herd expands, the conflict with Rollins escalates, and old wounds continue to heal? The BLM trailer arrived at sunrise, rumbling up the dirt road in a storm of dust. Ethan stood by the corral, arms folded, trying to steady the pulse hammering in his throat. Ghost and Willow were already on edge, ears flicking nervously at the sound of grinding brakes. Melissa hopped down from her SUV, clipboard in hand. Transport went smoother than expected, she said, though the lines around her eyes betrayed her tension. But remember, they're fresh out of the roundup pens. They won't come quiet. 2 handlers opened the trailer gate. The first horse stepped out a dun mare, with a jagged scar across her shoulder, stiff with every movement. She kept her head low, eyes dull, as if she had already accepted pain as the only language of the world. Old one's tougher than she looks, one handler muttered. Name's Sage, Ethan said, without thinking, the word catching in his throat like an oath. Next came the second mare, a chestnut barely more than a filly. She stumbled as she walked, each breath a wheeze, her sides heaving against an invisible weight. Melissa frowned, scribbling notes. Respiratory infection, maybe worse. We'll need antibiotics immediately. Ethan watched her sway and whispered, Ember. She burns just to breathe. The last to emerge was the stallion. Young, muscled, fire burning in his eyes, even through the streaks of blood across his flank. He reared as soon as his hooves hit dirt, charging the fence until the handlers shouted, straining against ropes. It took all their strength to funnel him into the holding pen. Ethan's chest tightened. He recognized that kind of rage. It was the same that had once lived in him, raw, untamed, dangerous, because it was born of fear. Rebel, he murmured. That one's rebel. The ranch was chaos for hours. Sage limped circles around the pen, ears pinned, refusing food. Ember lay down too often, her breathing rattling louder with each passing hour. Rebel slammed the fence again and again, teeth bared, hooves cracking wood. Ghost and Willow answered with their own alarm. Ghost trotted the perimeter of his corral, ears flattened, snorting challenges across the dirt. Willow pressed against him, limping more heavily than she had in weeks, undone by the disruption. They'll tear themselves apart, Sarah warned, wiping sweat from her brow as she finished examining Ember. This isn't just veterinary work, Ethan. This is herd dynamics colliding head-on. Ethan leaned against the fence, watching Rebel strike again. He's not just fighting us, he said. He's fighting everything that ever hurt him. Sarah gave him a sharp look. Sound familiar? He didn't answer. Over the next days, the ranch became a battlefield of patience. Ethan split his time between tending to Ember's fragile lungs, reinforcing Sage's shoulder with careful wraps, and standing silently near Rebel's pen, letting the stallion rage without interference. Melissa documented everything, cameras humming, notes stacking, but even she admitted, this isn't data, this is survival. At night, Ethan sat on the porch, watching 5 sets of shadows move across the moonlit dust. He thought of Afghanistan, of green recruits dropped into chaos, every man broken in a different way. Some fought until nothing was left, some folded, some clawed their way back. Which ones were these horses? Which one was he? The breaking point came on the 5th evening. Rebel had been pacing non-stop, sweat darkening his hide. When Ethan approached with a bucket of water, the stallion struck the fence with such force that a board splintered clean through. "Ethan!" Sarah shouted, rushing forward. "He'll break out!" But Ethan held up a hand. He stepped slowly into Rebel's line of fire, bucket still in hand. The stallion reared again, dust exploding under his hooves. Ghost whinnied from across the ranch, ears flat, ready to charge if fences allowed. Ethan didn't flinch. He set the bucket down in the dirt, then stepped back, palms open. "It's yours," he said quietly. "No fight, just water." For a long, breathless moment, Rebel's eyes blazed. Then, slowly, he dropped his head, nostrils flaring. He sniffed the bucket, then drank, sides heaving with exhaustion. The silence that followed was heavier than any roar. That night, Ethan wrote in the binder Melissa had given him. Trust doesn't start with control. It starts with letting go. He stared at the words, then closed the book, hands trembling. But peace was short-lived. The next morning, Ethan found Ghost pacing the fence line, muscles taut, eyes fixed on Rebel's pen. Willow pressed close, anxious. Across the way, Rebel had resumed his restless circling, but this time his focus was different, not on the humans, but on Ghost. "They've seen each other now," Sarah murmured. "2 stallions, 1 territory. It's only a matter of time." Ethan's stomach sank. He could feel it in the charged air, in the way dust seemed to hang heavier. Something was coming. Something he might not be able to stop. Rebel and Ghost saw each other through the fence. Both were wounded and proud, and a confrontation was inevitable. The question remained, can Ethan prevent the collision between the 2 stallions, or will the collision itself decide the fate of the herd? Dawn painted the desert in gray-blue shadows when Ethan heard the first challenge. A piercing whinny split the silence, so sharp it made the hair on his arms rise. He stepped onto the porch, boots crunching grit, and saw Ghost at the far end of his corral, neck arched, hooves striking the ground. Across the yard, Rebel answered in kind, ears pinned, eyes blazing. The storm had begun. Willow pressed against Ghost's flank, trembling but refusing to retreat. Sage and Ember stirred nervously in their pens, Ember coughing against the chill. Ethan's pulse hammered. He moved quickly, grabbing a rope halter, though he knew it was useless against what was coming. Sarah emerged from the small cabin where she'd slept overnight, hair tied back, eyes wide. "They've locked onto each other," she said, voice taut. 2 stallions, same territory. This was inevitable. Melissa came behind her, tablet forgotten in her hand. "We need to separate them farther." Ethan shook his head. "Distance won't fix this. They've scented each other. They know." As if to prove his words, Rebel lunged against his fence, teeth snapping wood. Ghost answered with a violent strike of hooves, shattering a fence board of his own. Sarah swore. "If they get through—" Ethan cut her off. "If they get through, then I let them. But I'll be damned if it kills them." For hours, the ranch vibrated with the energy of 2 stallions measuring each other. Ghost paced his corral, every muscle taut, but he never took his eyes off Rebel. Rebel struck again and again, each time with less fear, more determination. Ethan watched, heart clenched. He remembered firefights overseas, 2 forces circling, daring the other to break. The young ones rushed headlong into chaos. The veterans waited, conserving energy, choosing their ground. "Ghost is me now," Ethan murmured under his breath. "Rebel's me then." Sarah glanced at him sharply, but she didn't speak. The breaking point came at dusk. Rebel had worn his pen thin, boards cracked, posts loosened. With a furious scream, he reared and crashed down. Wood splintered, dust erupted. Suddenly, there was nothing between him and Ghost. Willow cried out, stumbling back. Ember shrieked. Sage pressed into her corner, scarred shoulder twitching. Ghost and Rebel met in the open space with a thunder of hooves. The ground shook beneath their collision. Dust swallowed them in a whirl of violence. Melissa gasped, but Ethan raised a hand. "Don't move." The two stallions reared, striking with forelegs, teeth flashing. Ghost drove Rebel back a pace, but Rebel lunged again, reckless, relentless. Their cries tore through the desert air. Ethan's instinct screamed to intervene, but something deeper held him still. This was not cruelty, this was order. This was nature writing its law in dust and blood. Sarah whispered, "They'll kill each other." Ethan shook his head, though doubt gnawed him raw. No, they're fighting for place, not for life. Minutes dragged like hours. At last, Ghost landed a crushing strike that sent Rebel stumbling sideways. But instead of pressing for the kill, Ghost stopped, head high, chest heaving. He pawed the ground once, snorted hard. Rebel staggered, then froze. His ears flicked. Slowly, painfully, he lowered his head. Submission. The corral fell silent, except for the rasp of breath. Willow crept forward, pressing against Ghost's side. Rebel stood apart, sides heaving. Blood on his flank, but eyes no longer blazing with blind fury. Melissa exhaled shakily. "I've never seen anything like it." Ethan stepped forward, voice low. "You just saw the desert write its truth. No papers, no pens, no judges. Just survival and choice." That night, Ethan tended both stallions by lantern light. Ghost bore bruises, but stood tall, steady as stone. Rebel flinched at first touch, but when Ethan pressed a damp cloth to his wound, the young stallion stilled. For the first time, he didn't bare his teeth. "You're not my enemy," Ethan whispered. "Not anymore." Rebel's ear twitched, just once. In the days that followed, a fragile balance emerged. Ghost resumed his patrols, but no longer in fury. Rebel circled at a respectful distance, watching more than challenging. Sage began grazing steadily. Ember's breathing eased under steady care, her cough softening. Willow moved freer, though she rarely strayed far from Ghost. Sarah stood with Ethan by the corral one evening, arms folded, watching the 5 horses graze under the dying light. "You let it happen," she said. Most handlers would have tried to stop it, pushed them apart, used whips, gates, restraints. Ethan nodded slowly. "And it would have broken them, same as it nearly broke me. Sometimes you've got to face what you fear, bleed for it, before you can stand steady again." Sarah's eyes softened. "You're not just saving them, Ethan. You're saving yourself." He didn't answer. He couldn't. But peace never lasted long on this land. The rumble of a cruiser announced Ellis Monroe's arrival late one afternoon. Dust coated his hat, his face grave. He stepped out slow, eyes avoiding the corral for once. "Ethan," he said, voice low, "got news you won't like." Ethan's gut tightened. "Rollins?" Ellis nodded. "He's hired a legal team out of Reno. Big firm. He's pushing this water rights fight to the state level. Means hearings, courtrooms, reporters. He's playing to win, and he's got friends with pull." Melissa stiffened. "If the state rules against him," Ellis cut her off. "It won't just be fines this time. They could shut the whole program down, seize the land." Silence fell heavy. Ghost lifted his head from grazing, eyes fixed on Ethan as though sensing the shift. Rebel snorted, restless again. Ethan's chest burned. He had faced war, loss, his own demons. But this felt worse. He looked past Ellis, toward the horizon where the desert met the sky. Could he fight men with money and power the way he fought dust and scars? Rollins escalates the battle to the state level, bringing in a high-powered legal team. Ethan's efforts are in danger of being swept away. The question remains, how can a worn-out veteran fight against political and legal forces to protect his horses and his last piece of land? The courthouse in Carson City smelled of dust, old wood, and the faint tang of nerves. Ethan hadn't been inside a courtroom since he'd testified at a military tribunal years ago, and his palms sweated the same way now as they had then. Sarah sat beside him in the front row, her presence steady, a quiet anchor. Melissa checked files on her tablet, muttering reminders. Sheriff Ellis leaned against the back wall, silent but watchful, and Dr. Elena Vasquez, sharp-eyed and calm, shuffled papers filled with charts and soil analyses, their hidden weapon. Across the aisle sat Bill Rollins, dressed in a new suit that didn't quite hide the ranch dust beneath his nails. Flanked by 3 Reno attorneys, he looked like a man who already believed the land was his. He smirked at Ethan once, just enough to ignite the fire in his chest. When the gavel fell, the air tightened. Rollins' lead attorney rose first, voice smooth as glass. "Members of the board," he began. "This case is about fairness. For generations, Nevada ranchers like my client have upheld the balance of water usage. Then, without oversight, Mr. Callahan diverts resources for wild horses, draining the creek, endangering cattle, and setting a reckless precedent. He is no conservationist, he is a liability. Murmurs rippled through the room. Ethan's jaw clenched. He wanted to shout, "Lies!" But Sarah's hand on his arm reminded him, "Wait." The attorney displayed charts predicting water scarcity, blaming Ethan's program. Rollins nodded solemnly, playing the role of the wronged neighbor. When it was Melissa's turn, she stood with cool precision. With respect, those charts are projections, not facts. The Bureau of Land Management authorized Mr. Callahan under a provisional program. Our data show his practices reduce water waste compared to conventional ranching. Then she gestured to Elena. Dr. Vasquez approached, laying out soil samples, water test results, and photographs of riparian buffers Ethan had planted along the creek. Her voice was measured but firm. Controlled access points for his horses have stabilized creek banks, reducing erosion. Rain catchment system supplements supply. Downstream, water quality has improved. My conclusion, his ranch benefits the watershed. Mr. Rollins's property directly profits from these practices. The board members leaned in, notes scratched across paper. Rollins's attorneys whispered frantically, but the fight wasn't done. When called, Ethan rose. His boots echoed too loud on the wooden floor. Faces turned, expectant, skeptical. He cleared his throat. "I didn't come here to fight neighbors. I came here to tell the truth." His voice shook at first, but as he spoke, it steadied. 3 months ago, I found 2 mustangs trapped in a canyon. One was bleeding out. I saved them, because I couldn't leave them to die. Since then, they've saved me too. I'm a veteran. I came home from war broken, and those horses gave me something to fight for again. He paused, meeting the eyes of each board member. I don't take more than my share. I haul water. I built systems to conserve. If you shut this program down, you don't just punish me. You kill a chance to change how we treat wild horses. You kill second chances, mine and theirs. The room went silent. Even Rollins shifted uncomfortably, his smirk gone. Deliberation took an hour. Every tick of the courthouse clock gnawed Ethan's nerves raw. Sarah whispered encouragement. Melissa chewed her lip. Ellis stared at the floor. Finally, the board returned. The chairperson cleared her throat. After reviewing the evidence, we find insufficient grounds to support Mr. Rollins's claims. Furthermore, we recognize Mr. Callahan's practices as exemplary in conservation. His program is to continue with our recommendation for expanded support. A collective breath rushed through the room. Sarah gripped Ethan's hand. Melissa smiled in rare relief. Ellis tipped his hat. Rollins, red-faced, slammed his hat against his knee. His attorneys gathered their papers with tight jaws. The battle was lost. At least, this one. That night, Ethan returned to the ranch under a sky heavy with stars. Ghost and Willow greeted him at the fence, Rebel watching from the shadows, Sage steady, Ember breathing easier. "You're safe," he whispered, touching Ghost's muzzle. "For now." But even as the words left his lips, headlights swept across the yard. A truck idled at the gate, engine growling. Bill Rollins. He didn't get out. He just sat there, staring through the dark, the glow of a cigarette tip flaring in the cab. Then the truck reversed slowly, taillights disappearing into the desert night. Ethan stood frozen, heart pounding. Ghost snorted sharply, ears pricked toward the road. Rollins hadn't said a word, which meant he wasn't finished. Ethan won before the council, but Rollins withdrew quietly, a more dangerous sign than outright defeat. The question remains, what is he planning next? And will the horses be targeted? The desert was still when the trouble came. Midnight draped the Ruby Mountains in silence, stars sharp against the black. Ethan sat on the porch, half asleep in the rocking chair. Ghost's soft huffs rising from the corral. The ranch finally felt steady, fragile, but steady. Then came the crash. Wood splintered, horses screamed. Ethan jolted upright, boots pounding dirt before thought could catch. Lantern in hand, he tore toward the corral. Ghost reared, striking the air, Willow pressed against him, Ember wheezing in panic, Sage crashing her scarred shoulder against the boards. Rebel slammed the fence, eyes wild. And beyond the corral, shadows moved. Men. One carried a crowbar, another a coil of wire. Their voices hissed low, but urgent. Ethan's blood froze when he caught the glint of Rollins's truck parked crooked at the road. Son of a... Ethan grabbed the rifle he kept by the barn door. He didn't fire. He didn't even aim. He just racked it loud enough for the sound to slice the night. "Get the hell off my land!" His voice cracked the air like thunder. The men scattered, 2 vaulting the fence line, boots pounding toward Rollins's truck, but one lingered, crowbar still in hand, frozen in the lantern light. Rollins himself. "You don't belong here, Callahan," Rollins snarled. "Neither do they. This land ain't yours to turn into some circus." Ethan's hand shook, not from fear, but rage. Ghost stepped forward, body taut, head high, ears pinned. He looked like a sentinel carved from lightning. "They belong here more than you," Ethan said, "and you know it." Rollins spat in the dirt. "You can't fight the tide. You think one broken vet and a handful of nags change the way Nevada runs? You'll drown with them." Sheriff Ellis's voice cut through the dark. "Not tonight, Bill." Spotlights swept across the yard. Ellis's cruiser screeched to a stop, Sarah and Melissa right behind in her pickup. Melissa jumped out with her camera rolling, catching every second. Rollins's face drained of color as Ellis stepped forward, hand on his holster. "Drop the crowbar." For a long, taut second, Rollins's jaw worked. Then the bar clattered into the dirt. The rest blurred. Deputies cuffed Rollins, read him rights. Melissa documented the broken boards, the scattered wire meant for snares. Sarah calmed Willow, checked Ember's lungs, rubbed Sage's trembling neck. Rebel paced furiously, but didn't charge, his eyes fixed on Ghost, waiting. Ethan leaned against the fence, chest heaving. Ghost pressed his muzzle against Ethan's shoulder, a steadying weight. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel like he was holding the stallion up. Ghost was holding him. Ellis clapped a hand on Ethan's arm. "It's over. You did right." But Ethan wasn't sure. Looking at the broken corral, at the horses still shaking with fear, he wondered if battles like this ever really ended. Morning brought silence, heavy and strange. Rollins was in custody. The county buzzed with talk of charges, attempted vandalism, animal cruelty, trespassing. For once, the law was on Ethan's side. Yet he couldn't shake the image of headlights in the dark, of hooves thrashing against broken boards. Melissa sat at his kitchen table, laptop open. "With this footage," she said, "Rollins won't bother you again, and the board will double your funding. They'll want to make this ranch a model program." Sarah added gently, "You've built more than a ranch, Ethan. You've built a refuge. For them, for yourself, for anyone who needs it." Ethan looked out the window. Ghost grazed steady, Rebel standing just far enough away to acknowledge the truce. Willow leaned into Sage, the two mares sharing weight. Ember dozed in the sun, her breathing clear for the first time. A family, broken but whole. His throat tightened. For years he'd carried only ghosts of war. Now, he carried Ghost and all the others who refused to be forgotten. Weeks later, volunteers came. Veterans, students, neighbors, once skeptical but now curious. They mended fences, painted barns, built shelters. Ethan taught them not how to tame horses, but how to stand still with them, to listen. Ghost became the anchor, Rebel the test, Willow the survivor, Sage the elder, Ember the spark. Together they showed people what Ethan had learned the hard way. Healing wasn't about erasing scars. It was about living with them. By autumn, a sign hung at the ranch gate. Silver Sage Sanctuary, where second chances run free. Ethan stood beneath it one evening, Sarah at his side, Ellis watching from the cruiser, Melissa taking a final round of photos. The wind carried laughter from the volunteers, the steady sound of hooves against dirt, the rhythm of life reborn. For the first time since the war, Ethan allowed himself to believe. Maybe he had a future, but belief shattered quickly. That night, as lanterns dimmed and the ranch settled into sleep, Ethan walked the perimeter one last time. The desert stretched silent, endless. Ghost followed at his shoulder, unasked but present. Near the gate, something caught Ethan's eye. An envelope tucked between slats of the fence. No postage, no name, just one word scrawled in black ink. Watcher. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, taken from a distance. It showed Ethan in the corral, brushing Rebel's mane. His stomach dropped. The paper trembled in his hands. Someone had been watching. And Rollins wasn't the only enemy out there. The ranch has become a place of healing and hope. But the anonymous photo leaves open the question, who is watching Ethan and the horses, and what is their true purpose?